local carbon markets policy expert at Carbon Market Watch. So to give everyone a little bit of context in case you haven't been following this issue closely, at COP26 in Glasgow last year, after 6 years of heated negotiations, carbon markets and rules governing them under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement were adopted. Since then, civil society organizations are striving to ensure that carbon markets under Article 6 are designed and governed by rules that guarantee deep and drastic emissions reductions, as well as the protection and promotion of the rights of local and indigenous communities. So a rights-based approach should be central to the design of all market activities, because carbon market projects can harm local communities and indigenous peoples, and they have done so in the past. That is why one of civil society's main asks at COP26 was the creation of an independent grievance process. But exactly how it will be set up and governed, how robust it will be, and the ability for communities to ensure access to right to remedy is yet to be determined and negotiated. There is still a lot of work to be done to ensure that market activities and their implementation don't undermine human rights. In addition, as noted by the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, parties should ensure that market-based mechanisms have effective means for protecting human rights and effective compliance and redress mechanisms to this effect. So our aim today is to assess past experiences and discuss core principles for the grievance process mandated in Article 6.4 with the help of our expert panel, which we thank so much. We understand that it's a very busy week, so thank you all for being here today. So I will start with Erika on my right, who is Erika Lennon, Senior Attorney in the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law. Her work focuses on climate finance, climate accountability, and advocating for the protection of human rights in their responses to climate change, including implementation of the Paris Agreement. Erika also has long worked to improve independent accountability and grievance mechanisms at international financial institutions, including climate funds, to ensure communities have access to remedy. So over to you, Erika.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for inviting me to be, oh, that got louder. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I'm going to talk briefly sort of about an overview of why grievance mechanisms are important, the history that we've had with this, the history, thank you, the history we've had with grievance mechanisms in carbon markets and in other situations, and then some critical elements that we'd like to see for the Article 6 mechanism. So as Mirto mentioned, projects that take place in the generation of carbon credits have a history of negatively impacting people, negatively impacting their environment, infringing on people's human rights, infringing on the rights of indigenous peoples. And so it's critical that there's a place and an avenue for them to seek remedy. And we didn't have that under the clean development mechanism, and in many carbon market schemes, we don't have that. In contrast, over the course of the last 30 years or so, grievance mechanisms have become a standard in international financial institutions, in climate finance institutions, to ensure that people have a place where they can seek remedy if and when they face harms to their communities, when people face harms, when there are harms to their environment, because we know things can and do go wrong in those spaces. And so they're critically important. And really, grievance mechanisms and independent grievance mechanisms provide a critical backstop and are necessary for ensuring remedy. And it's not just that remedy is nice or it's nice to have some place to go. It's that you have a right to remedy. You have a human right to remedy. And that is often not, it is often very hard to get depending on the country you're in, depending on the situation you're in. And with some of these, depending on, immunities of organizations, et cetera, the only place you have to go potentially is an independent grievance mechanism, which is one of the reasons they're so critical. Because even if you have in place strong safeguards, even if those safeguards are based in human rights, respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, have strong safeguards for protecting the environment and ecosystem integrity, we know things can and do go wrong, and we've seen that with carbon market projects in the past. So there have, long been tales of, I think one of the one people know most is the Barro Blanco Dam in Panama, which flooded people's lands and displaced them. Communities in Chile have faced displacement, have faced problems with right to food and water for projects that are generating carbon credits and that are then being sold and being touted and saying, this is a good climate project, here you go, but it's at the same time harming communities, harming their ecosystems. And that can be dealt with to some extent by putting in place strong safeguards, but also when those fail, they need a place to go to seek remedy. And too often they haven't had that place. And they may have that place at other financiers, but it's important to have options. And the UNFCCC shouldn't be under the Paris Agreement shouldn't be sanctioning projects that violate people's rights, but they also then need to make sure that there's a place for people to go if and when those are violated, because it may be that there's not access to a court, that there's not access to some other mechanism, and so it's important that under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, that really for any activity that's taking place in Article 6, people have a place to go where they can seek remedy and seek redress. And so that had long been an advocacy point, and at the close of COP26 in Glasgow, there is a provision in the rules for Article 6.4 that they have to create an independent grievance process. What that process will look like and how that will be set up now has to be done. And so that's where we find ourselves. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some of the recommendations for what that should look like going forward, because we don't have it yet. It hasn't been set up yet. And that's one of the critical things, and one of the things that really needs to be set in motion at this COP. It's not enough to say we're going to have an independent grievance process in the rules if it never gets set up, and it needs to be set up before activities take place under Article 6 is first and foremost key, because if you start having activities that are generating carbon credits, that's when people may start being harmed. That's when their environments and ecosystems may be damaged, and they need a place to seek remedy. And so before anything can happen, these processes need to be set up. And so likely we need an outcome here mandating that to happen. But it's not enough to sort of just say, okay, we're going to have an independent grievance process. You can email this address, or you can put in a complaint form. That's not what we mean when we say we want a grievance mechanism to comply with sort of the good practice or the best practice we've seen so far. Grievance mechanisms, one, it needs to be independent. So it shouldn't it should apply across Article 6, not just Article 6.4, which is where it currently is in the rule book. But it shouldn't sit with the Article 6.4 supervisory body, because the body that is approving projects or saying these are good carbon credit projects should not then also be the one assessing whether or not where a community is going to say things have gone wrong. And while there should be one at the independent mechanism, there should be an independent one at the UNFCCC and as a body. It should also mandate that there are project level grievance mechanisms, because often the best place for communities to seek remedy is really where these things are taking place, and these should also follow the same standards. But it's important to have both, because sometimes project level grievance mechanisms don't work. Sometimes communities don't want to access them because they fear retaliation, or they see them really as just the people doing the project, and so the people causing the harm are then the ones you're seeking remedy from. You may not have trust in that. So we need to have a mechanism here at the UNFCCC, and for that to be sort of best or good and in line with good practice, it needs to be legitimate, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be predictable, it needs to be equitable, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be rights compatible, and it should also be a source of continuous learning, so that the same things don't go wrong continually, and so that, you know, the supervisory body, or that how credits are being generated aren't being generated from projects that are causing the same things over and over again. And so in order to do those things, some things need to be in place. So if you're looking at it being legitimate, it needs to be independent. It can't, as I've mentioned, when you're looking at things around accessibility, it needs to be a place that communities or people harmed are able to reach. So you need to know how to find it. It needs to be displayed. There needs to be avenues for people to know that it exists, and that should be apparent at a site where a project is taking place that is generating these carbon credits. It should be on websites. It should be prominent. You should be able to submit complaints in any language, in any form, whether that's handwritten, whether that's a voicemail, whether that's a video message. It should be the way that you as a community member want to transmit that information. They have to be predictable, so the mechanisms themselves have to have rules that sort of put in place. These are the steps that may be taken. This is what's going to happen. Here's the timeline for how things are going to go. It needs to be equitable. Too often, the people in situations where there are projects or activities generating carbon credits, the communities on the ground, the indigenous communities, women, whoever's being impacted, are not sitting in the same place of power as the people who are implementing the projects, and so there needs to be a balancing of equitability or a balancing of power to make it more equitable. It has to be transparent, so it has to have rules that people can see. They have to know what's going to happen, what might happen, how they can seek remedy. I've already mentioned that it should be a source of learning, and then it also has to be rights compatible. And so grievance redress processes really go hand in hand with creating strong environmental and social safeguards, with ensuring meaningful stakeholder consultation, including respecting international law, including respecting things, for example, like the Indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent. That's all part of it, because you have to have in place these processes in order for the mechanism to be rights compatible. Because if a mechanism is trying to figure out how to provide remedy, or determining whether something has gone wrong, and that an entity should be held to account, it has to have something to judge that against. And so those underlying rules also need to be rights compatible. And currently, the safeguards still have to be developed. There's rules within the rules that were adopted in Glasgow. There are references that the mechanisms rules, and that the things that are happening need to avoid or minimize environmental and social risk. There's also how the supervisory body needs to determine or come up with rules that will ensure that they respect, protect human rights, the rights of Indigenous people, gender equality, etc. And at this COP, and the supervisory body is still doing work. It hasn't finished its work, certainly on methodologies, but the one document we've seen that has come forward from the supervisory body has been a document on activities involving removals, which have many, many problems in and of themselves. All removal activities, whether they be land-based, whether they be engineering-based, so things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, all of which have the potential for really causing harm to communities and their environment. And so not only have they adopted a sort of broad definition and not excluded anything, they've also, in their language about how to minimize environmental and social risk, have already put in caveats about how the standards that will be developed may be hampered, or they have to keep in mind national prerogatives, which undermines the universality of them and undermines how they're going to be able to go. And so even already we're seeing where there may be problems with the underlying safeguards that would exist, which makes a grievance mechanism, one, those should be rejected as recommendations on this in the first instance, but it also makes a grievance mechanism all the more important, because we're already seeing where there may be problems and that communities are likely then going to be harmed and will need a place to seek remedy. And so it's imperative, one, that they develop those processes further, but also that they then put in place this grievance mechanism soon, and that it's coupled with policies for consultation, for the protection of, for ensuring ecosystem integrity, for the protection of human rights, to really make it rights-based. And I'll also mention that, practices at the mechanism itself have to be rights-based. And so when they're creating this mechanism, they also need to consider how the mechanism itself will ensure that it is not compromising people's human rights. So having policies in place for dealing with retaliation, making sure you can submit complaints confidentially so that communities who are using these mechanisms aren't put at risk. Because the last thing you would want is communities that are already being harmed or think they're being harmed to then face risk by coming forward to say, we need remedy for this. And so I will close by saying that it's critically important that that going forward, that creating this independent grievance mechanism is at the top of the list. The supervisory body and shouldn't be, creating and figuring out ways to incorporate removals or to bring in or to start these market mechanisms without, first and foremost, considering the ways to protect people, to protect their rights, to protect their ecosystems, and that means creating this grievance mechanism, and that when they're doing it, they really need to comply with best practice and best standards, which come, and I should say these aren't just civil society asks, these comes from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which set up sort of the standards for what makes a good grievance mechanism. And those principles, again, are that it has to be legitimate, accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, rights compatible, and a source of continuous learning. And without doing that, it's going to risk repeating mistakes of the past, not having in place proper avenues for communities to seek remedy, and will likely lead to then, the Paris Agreement rubber stamping or allowing for carbon credits to be bought and sold that are being done so while also harming communities, local communities and indigenous peoples around the world and just damaging ecosystems. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Erika, for your analysis and recommendations and for the links you've made to the current negotiating agenda. Our next speaker is Ghazali Ohorella, negotiations team leader of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus on matters of Article 6. Ghazali's experience is centered on the intersection of human rights and international politics, with a special focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples. He's a product of the Indigenous Ailifuru people of South Maluku, an archipelago situated between Australia and the Philippines. Since 2003, he successfully engaged with and was the principal author of numerous reports submitted to United Nations bodies. He was member of the Indigenous lobbying team for the high-level plenary meeting of the UN General Assembly, to be known as the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples. Over to you, Ghazali.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining, as well as to organize this very super important event. And I can imagine that you'd rather be outside. It's nice and hot, but you have comfortable chairs. So the only thing that's lacking is popcorn, I would say. So sit back, relax, and I would say enjoy the ride. However, I do want you to listen to what we're about to say. So while you're sitting there, imagine everyone has had grandparents, right? Imagine you going back in the time that you had, went past by your grandparents. You're probably at coffee or dinner, and like after generations, you own that house now. You live in that house. And still there's a lot of memories in there. There's a lot of emotions in there. You feel connected to the house. And then all of a sudden somebody stops by and says, hey, you need to move, you need to move out. You got nothing to say, you need to move out. Obviously, you don't want to. If there's no justified reason, then you would love to stay in your own house that you actually took over from your parents and grandparents and so on. Let's scale that a little bit. From grandparents to family, family to community, from community to peoples. Indigenous peoples, like we have situated on our lands since time immemorial. And the land is part of us, as we are part of the land. It's part of our identity. That is where we grow up, where we want to grow our community, and that's where we want to continue living as a peoples. When you look at the situation that we're in right now, and the potential removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, that's a human rights violation. So where do you go to? Who do you go to? It has been said often enough, and I'll hate to repeat it, because I hate to repeat it, but I'll say it again. 80% of the roles for maintaining the biodiversity is on the lands of indigenous peoples. So if there is any people that knows how to fight climate change, how to live in harmony with the natural environment, surely it will be indigenous peoples. So why would you kick them off their lands? So we have enough to contribute to the climate regime, climate action. And that's why we are also engaging in this Article 6 negotiations, alongside Erika and many other constituencies. We had 3 priorities. One is to ensure that our rights are protected. Because we are, as indigenous peoples, we have the right to self-determination. We have collective rights. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I urge you to look it up. Because it outlines provisions and rights, not new rights, but rights that we should have had all along. But only in 2007, the United Nations chose to change its attitude vis-a-vis indigenous peoples, to go from consideration to commitment to the rights of indigenous peoples. Because our lands is everything to us. Again, going back to the example of you and your grandparents. Obviously, you want to talk to the ones that are going to evict you. So you want to participate in the process. Plead to them that you want to stay on your lands, stay in your house of your former grandparents. But what if that is not possible? What if there is no possibility for you to talk to that person or talk to that entity? you need to have that off-ramp. You need to have that back door. You need to have something that's behind, at the end of the line that you can go to. And that's the grievance process that we're looking at right now. Because the 3 priorities for indigenous peoples in Article 6 negotiations. 1, like I said, human rights safeguards. You have the first preamble, the 11th preamble paragraph, it's been operationalized. It's in Article 6. Second is to ensure that we have full and effective participation. Free, prior, informed consent is what Erika said. That nothing happens without us. If you look at the text of Article 6, look at Article 6.4, paragraph 31E, it says like consultation according to domestic arrangements. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not a domestic arrangement. It's an international standard. It includes our rights. And our rights are secured, are secured in that declaration. So any process of consultation needs to be in line with the rights of indigenous peoples. As you would like to have the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process, whether you will have to leave your house or not. If that particular paragraph in the text is not in line with the rights of indigenous peoples, then you have to make a very strong grievance process. It is of vital importance that the grievance process is in there, that is robust, that it is independent, and that, like Erika said, is accessible. The vast majority of indigenous peoples do not live near a Wi-Fi tower, do not have 5G internet access. The vast majority of indigenous peoples may not even speak the language. They have their own language. And that is, to complement what Erika said about accessibility, this grievance process should also be accessible for indigenous peoples. They don't have, so that they don't, if they're on Tuvalu, for example, that they don't have to travel to New York to file for a grievance in relation to the lands and when it comes to these carbon markets. And then when you talk about, and has been said many times before, and I would like to reemphasize what this former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have said, Professor James Anaya, when it comes to, and he's did a multi-year study on extractive industries. That when it comes to the grievance process, it's to be fair, just, accessible, and transparent. And I would add the things that Erika said as well to the equation. And in any grievance process, it should not be, all right, upload your PDF file and we'll get back to you in 6 months. There are numerous grievance processes out there that we can draw inspiration from. Surely the grievance process that is independent, and additionally, we want to have a mechanism in there, but it's a process. Who knows what the process is? You have to figure out with the supervisory body and the member states what they actually mean with the independent grievance process. But it needs to have teeth. You need to have the ability of the grievance mechanism should have the ability to, ideally, if a project is not in line with the rights of indigenous peoples or human rights, that it impacts the credits. Because otherwise, you get, quote unquote, sustainability, and when you look behind, people are dead. No more lands, nothing. And that's why this grievance process needs to maintain a high level of integrity. And when you look around the world, there are many. There can be a whole host of grievance processes out there, and there are some of them that have actually been shaped with the assistance of indigenous peoples. And I think that is something that should be included when you talk about shaping or designing the grievance process. That the people that are affected or potentially to be affected, that they can help shape it. When you look at, and I come from a human rights background, like I have, my knowledge about markets is goose egg, zero. But it's growing, obviously, with Article 6. So when you look at the UN system itself, the UN has a committee on the eradication of racial discrimination. And it has a process that's called early warnings, early action. And you can submit a grievance. And the committee itself, and the committee can then, and that committee has teeth, actually. Because to the member state that has signed on to the treaty, it can tell that state to stop, for example, removing indigenous peoples from their lands. That's a dedicated grant mechanism from the Conservation International. That is something that you can also look into. There's a Forest Stewardship Council, something totally different. However, it is a grievance mechanism. Indigenous peoples helped shape it. You can look into that as well. And you look across the board, what the core principles are. It's the principles that I just mentioned, and added with the principles that Erika just referred to. And yes, this grievance process should be independent. It should not be related or limited to Article 6.4 only, because Article 6.8 is there as well. And we need to make sure that in the full application of Article 6, that indigenous peoples, local communities, and other constituencies have access to a grievance process. This actually should also have the possibility to do an early warning. Hey, this is about to happen. We want to let you know that this is about to go down on our lands or in our communities. That should also be part of it. Because why be behind the fact whilst you also can be like before the fact? So I just want to end with that story of your grandparents' house, right? Your grandparents' house is our lands. And on the front end, we want to have the full and effective participation in the consultation process, and that you seek our consent, the free prior informed consent. That's the front end. But at the back end, there always needs to be an independent grievance process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ghazali. We're turning to our third speaker, Paco Gimenez-Salinas, compliance and dispute resolution specialist for the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. Paco was born in Spain, is a lawyer by profession specialized in alternative dispute resolution with a focus on mediation. He has participated in cases handled by the Compliance Advisory Ombudsman as an external facilitator, as well as in cases managed by the Independent Consultation and Investigation Mechanism in the role of its consultation phase coordinator. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much to the organizers of this event for inviting the independent redress mechanism. I will provide a general overview of the mechanism, and I also will be providing inputs on how indigenous people's rights and human rights are embedded in the system of the GCF and in the IRM. And then also will share some recommendations. Probably I will not repeat the recommendations that Erika already shared. Those are what we call the effectiveness criteria of a GRM, being transparent, legitimate, etc. But I will skip that. So when we arrive to these slides, we can jump them. So it is important talking about the mandate of the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. It's important to mention that it was established in the governing instrument of the UNFCCC. So the mandate comes really from the very top and from the origin of the Green Climate Fund. Next slide, please. As for the functions that the IRM performs, the main one is entertaining complaints and grievances from people who are affected or that feel that or who feel that they could be affected in the future by GCF funded projects and programs. We also have a function where countries, developing countries who have been denied funding from the Green Climate Fund, from the board, they could come to the IRM and seek our assistance in maybe suggesting that the board reconsider their decision to not fund a particular project or program. We also provide, and this is a very important function, capacity building to a very big number, growing number of accredited entities. So for those who don't know how the GCF operates, the GCF channels its funding through what we call accredited entities. Those are intermediaries, and they also need to be accredited by the GCF. Part of this accreditation includes having a GRM. So the ecosystem of redress, as we call it at the IRM of the GCF, it's composed by not only the independent redress mechanism at the institutional level of the GCF, but also from like up to 100 probably accredited entities who have to have and have their own GRMs. We at the IRM provide help to build their capacity. We also have the function of conducting outreach, and I have here sitting my colleague who is in charge of that function, Peter Carlson. And it is important, it's a very important function because it ensures that that people know where to go when they are being harmed by a GCF funded project, right? And this is not an easy task given the scope of and the number of projects of the GCF, so that requires a lot of effort. A lot of emphasis needs to be put on not only those principles, also having a very strong outreach function. And this is something that we have learned at the IRM, that probably we should have emphasized that role from the very beginning. The IRM, I don't know, Erika, is about 6 or 7 years old right now, yeah? So only very recently we have hired like a professional who is only dedicated to conducting outreach. Outreach is very important. Finally, we also have an advisory function that allows us to, based on international best practices and on the lessons learned by through the handling of our complaints, we can then provide advisory services to the board. Next slide, please. So this slide very quickly depicts what is a quite common process on how we handle complaints. So after declaring the case eligible, then parties are offered two types of processes. One is mediation, which is a dialogue-based process where the IRM acts as a facilitator of the conversation, in a safe space, aiming to help the parties to reach an amicable solution to their concerns. If that process mediation process does not result in a final agreement, or if from the very beginning parties decide not to even try and engage that process, then what we launch is what we call a compliance review. The compliance review is an investigative process, which goes is to look at whether the GCF, when designing and implementing the project, was in compliance or not with GCF policies, and whether, in case of that investigation concluding that there was non-compliance, whether that non-compliance also was linked to the harm that was produced. That compliance then ends with a report that is submitted to the board of the GCF, and in that report we recommend what actions the board should be adopting, including remedies, and maybe also policies changes and adapt. Next slide, please. So now talking about how human rights are embedded or like integrated in the activities of the GCF, but also the activities of the IRM. One of the GCF commitments is that in carrying out its mandate, the GCF will manage environmental and social risks. And this is facilitated by a set of processes and policies. The main two ones, I would say, is the Environmental and Social Policy, ASP, which provides the framework on how these social and environmental risks will be managed. But then in addition to that, we also apply the environmental and social safeguards, a set of environmental and social safeguards. And as an interim measure, the GCF is applying the International Financial Institution, International Financial Corporation social and environmental safeguards. We are crafting our own safeguards, and they will be probably launched in the very near future. But so far we are using the IFC standards. Human rights in the environmental and social policy, not in the safeguards, but in the environmental and social policy, are expressly mentioned. And the statement is as follows: all activities supported by the GCF will be designed and implemented in a manner that will promote, protect, and fulfill universal respect for and observance of human rights for all recognized by the United Nations. GCF will require the application of robust environmental and social due diligence so that the supported activities do not cause, promote, contribute to, perpetuate, or exacerbate adverse human rights impacts. Why is it very important to expressly mention human rights as part of the overall environmental and social framework? Because many other institutions, also like the GCF, also follow or apply the IFC safeguards. But the IFC safeguards only have cross references on human rights. So for instance, in the Standard 7 on Indigenous peoples, or the standard Performance Standard 4 on community health, they do mention human rights. But it is not a standalone, there is no standalone safeguard on human rights. And this is probably one of the recommendations, that in setting up a new independent mechanism, grievance mechanism, also thinking about what safeguards should be applied, there should be a standalone safeguard on human rights. That has several benefits. One of the main benefits is that when there is progress on human rights, those policies do not need to be adapted. So they are being automatically adapted because they are linked to international treaties on human rights, etc. Another benefit for a GRM is that compliance review, the investigation that I was referring to before, can easily access information on the United Nations human rights system. And in addition, on the issue of remedy, UN human rights standards look more broadly on remedy because in addition to compensation, they also include restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So there are several benefits of not only having the IBSC, which I think are seen as a great example of standards, but also having, for instance, like the UNDP, having a standalone safeguards on human rights. Next slide, please. On the issue on how indigenous people's rights are also part of the system, the governing instrument for the GCF, as well as the other policies that I mentioned that address environmental and social impacts, reflect the importance of fully and effectively engage with indigenous peoples in the design, development, and implementation of the activities to be financed by the GCF. It was at the 15th meeting of the board that the Secretariat of the Green Climate Fund was requested to develop an indigenous people's policies. And the guiding principles for these policies will include development and implementing free, prior, and informed consent, respect and enhance the rights of indigenous peoples to their land, territories, and resources, recognition of key international human rights and principles with regard to indigenous peoples, the respect of the right of indigenous peoples under voluntary isolation, the respect and recognition of traditional knowledge and livelihood systems, the enhancing of the capacity for indigenous peoples issues within the GCF, and finally, to facilitate access to GCF resources for indigenous peoples. Also, finally, sorry, I missed that, respecting also the system for self-government. Now, we will skip to the last one. Last one. Go, you have to go all the way. That was poor coordination here on the topic. So, I think this is a very critical point. It is important also to note that the grievance redress mechanism does not have the final decision-making power. It is an entity that only submits recommendation to, in our case, the board of the Green Climate Fund. So it might happen, and the board has the right to not adopt our recommendations. That, of course, to the frustration of complainants, probably, because they have gone a long way through these very complicated processes to finally see that the board might or might not adopt the recommendations of the grievance redress mechanism or the GRMs. So what can be done to limit that possibility? Is not to limit the power of the board, but to probably enable that decisions are being made in a fair way. And for that, the IRM, I think, is very unique in having what we call the board guidelines to decide on IRM recommendations. And these board guidelines set out several principles. Amongst them, the following. The decision makers, that in that case the board, should not start, when deciding on the recommendation of the IRM, should not start a new investigation. So the board should not try to challenge the investigative process and only provide answers to the final recommendations. The decision makers, in that case of the IRM, the board, should also be very explicit in describing what was the reasoning when not adopting the recommendations of the grievance redress mechanism, and to potentially like constrain the reasonings to the findings and not any other considerations. And finally, all decisions, including the reasoning, all decisions for adopting or not adopting, including the reasoning when not adopting, should be made public as well. So I think that with that, I will conclude the presentation and happy to discuss it further with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paco. I think we'll give Jonathan a moment to get in front of a mic.
Thank you. Can you hear all right? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the really interesting interventions. It was a really great panel and some great discussions. If I'll quickly maybe give a bit of an overview of some lessons that I drew from this, I think is obviously, first of all, having strong safeguards in the first place at the start is a great way of helping minimize risk of problems occurring, but that even with safeguards in place, things can still go wrong, and so there needs to be a legitimate avenue, and that this is actually a right. It's not just a luxury, but it's a right that needs to be in place. I think for the 6.4 supervisory body, it seems very clear from the interventions that, of course, there needs to be a grievance process in place before any projects start being registered, and that this should be distinct and independent from the supervisory body itself, so not under the supervisory body. We also heard several key principles, that there should be fairness, that it should be just, legitimate in the sense that it's trusted and independent, accessible, so in terms of cost, so there not being a cost associated with filing a grievance. The language as well is another issue, and not having to travel somewhere far away to file a grievance. Predictability, that the timing of the process is clear. So like Ghazali said, it's not just filing a grievance and then waiting 6 months and not knowing what's going to happen. Equitability, transparency, there's a lot of other great ones. I mean, rights, compatibility, and a source of continuous learning were all points that were mentioned. Yeah, and I think also it was interesting, Ghazali, that you mentioned that having an ability for a grievance process to be a function to warn in advance of something, so not only being reactive, but also being proactive. Yeah, so I could keep on going on further. But I think, also the fact that there should be both a project level grievance in place as well as a wider sort of mechanism level grievance. And also, as Paco, as you spoke to, that there's continuous outreach to ensure that local communities are properly equipped with knowing who to turn to if something goes wrong, what the process is there. So I think those are some quick reflections on the really great panel. I think, so we'll now transition to a Q&A from the audience. So I would invite audience members to start thinking of questions. I will start off with a few quick questions before we go to the audience. So the 6.4 supervisory body it seems we'll be planning to begin working on this starting next year, although it depends if that's delayed because of the recent developments, but we'll see. So what would your recommendations be for the process of developing this? So specifically, maybe to Ghazali and Erika, how should the supervisory body go about engaging and involving with a wide range of stakeholders, and especially indigenous peoples and local communities? So how can they be involved in designing this mechanism? And what are the specific steps or maybe things that should not be done? And then I have a question specifically for you, Paco, regarding the timeline. I was wondering if you could share a little bit of context about how GCF designed or how the IRM was designed in terms of sort of the overall timeline, just to get a sense of, potentially how long should the process be for the mechanism to be designed under the supervisory body? Is this something that takes, several months, longer? Yeah, and if there are elements in designing the IRM that took best practices from other mechanisms, was it starting entirely from scratch? Yeah, so any tips you might share on the overall design process for this new supervisory body grievance mechanism. So with that, yeah, so Erika and Ghazali, I think if you noted those questions, you could start off, and then Paco afterwards.
Sure, I can start. I mean, I think the answer to some extent is within your question. They should design it, when the supervisory body goes to design the mechanism, it should be designed fully, it should be designed transparently, and it should be designed fully with robust participation and consultation from stakeholders, from rights holders. And so how they should do this is, and they should draw lessons from other grievance mechanisms. I think we learned a lot, or they can learn a lot from mechanisms that already exist, like the IRM, which has in place a number of good practices, including, as Paco mentioned at the end, sort of like how you deal with those grievance mechanisms. And I think that tied back to one of the things Ghazali said about making sure that it has teeth and that it has something that it can do, so that the mechanism is able to, stop credits from being issued or stop a project from going forward or providing remedy in that way. But as far as the design goes, there are a number of ways of doing it. You can put out a call for inputs from rights holders, from stakeholders, from other mechanisms, and, say, share with us what the design should be. They could put forward a set of principles or a set of, they should start from the principles, but they could put forward a set of, like, this is what we think, this is our design of the mechanism, and then do rounds of consultation on that. But it should start with talking to the people who may use this mechanism, making sure that they're talking with, NGOs, yes, but to the extent they can, do outreach and talk to local communities. They should be talking to Indigenous peoples and thinking about how to create a grievance mechanism that everyone will be able to access. It should probably have several, it may need to have more than one round, but the process should also be one that is open, that is transparent, that is not over the course of a week or 2 weeks. There needs to be adequate time for communities and for Indigenous peoples to be able to input into the process. Because only if you're involving people from the beginning in the design of the mechanism are you going to design a mechanism that is going to be useful to them and designed in a way that is compatible with their rights and is something that is likely to be more accessible to them than not. And so I would say that the more outreach they can do, the more the supervisory body can do, can get input from stakeholders, the better. I'll pass it to Ghazali.
Thanks, and it's actually a very good question. And I fully agree with what Erika just now said. The process and the design of the process and the design itself should be with the protagonist in mind. Those that are going to use it, they should be fully involved. Participate fully into the entire process. The UNFCCC has a knack for creating workshops, so that could be part of it. But it's there's one example that I'd like to draw inspiration from. Is actually it's a process happening right now that's affecting Indigenous peoples. Probably has nothing to do with voluntary carbon markets, but it's with the participation of Indigenous peoples. There's the enhanced participation process of Indigenous peoples at the General Assembly, which I'm engaged in right now, and so which is a lengthy process. We all understand that, but it needs to start off, but it starts off with submissions. Submissions about ideas. We all know our principles. We all have heard from Indigenous people's point of view the grievances, the problems, the point of departure or the mindset in the submissions is to, like, what are your ideas? and what do you want to draw inspiration from. So the IRM is a good one. The DGM is a good one. The FSC is something you can look at. And you can just look from the whole, you can canvas the world from, for grievance processes that we can draw inspiration from. And let that be, let that be formed into a workshop. And you invite indigenous peoples, you invite local communities, you invite women and other constituencies. Because it is very important that those that are using it are intimate with it, that they know how to use it. And the only way that they know how to use it is that you that you allow the full and effective participation from the beginning, not the end, not when you dot the I's and cross the T's. It is from the beginning. You need to involve the very protagonists of the process. And then and that is a good start, because you get this. Obviously, it's an intergovernmental process, the UNCCC. There's no way of denying it. But it can including in the protagonists can set a very good basis for discussion. And I think that the stronger the basis is, the better the outcome will be. And I think that is, I hope that will be, they will be looking into that. And like Erika said, and we've experienced it this week already, give them time. Even though it's, time is of the essence, we all know that climate is changing, but these things take time, and you need to take the necessary time to invite indigenous peoples and other constituencies to participate in the process and give sufficient time towards ironing out all the issues. You cannot cut corners in this. We've seen it happen already. You cannot cut corners. And with the grievance process as well. So I think it's not a clear-cut idea, but it's parts of it, I think, that we can submit to at this point. Thanks.
Yes. On the question on when should the GRM be implemented, I fully support the idea of having it as early as possible. I think that this is the example that the GCF also followed. Although, if I have to share, that came with a little bit of challenges in the case of the GCF. Why? Because the GCF at the beginning had not many policies in place. And the GCF also, it took a long time, several years, to start having projects being approved in the pipeline, being approved, and then not only being approved, but also being dispersed, right? So I joined the IRM 3 years ago, and I think that the IRM had been in place, had been functioning for 3 years already. And the first year that I joined, we had no complaints. And that, I mean, it could be ideal, not having complaints, but it was putting us a little bit of risk, because people were questioning, why do we have this also costly system or unit with staff and budget and so, if they don't have any complaint, right? So I think that was, now this is not anymore the case. Probably the problem will be the adapting our resources to the level, to the number of complaints that we're receiving. So thinking on, there's going to be always a transition period, especially when something is being created from scratch. There's going to be a transition period where you will have the system, you will have to be dedicated to consulting, to do consultations with the stakeholders, also to craft the policies. I also, looking at the procedures, I think that there's best practices on the procedures, and there is no need to be very innovative. Probably there is room, but I think that the core of the rules are already there. An idea that could be explored and I think it's very interesting, and it's been done in Europe, is having the same GRM serving different institutions. I think the biggest benefit of such a model, where the same GRM is servicing different clients or different boards, is that independence is really strengthened. It is more difficult to try to modify or try to influence an independent grievance redress mechanism if it is serving different institutions at the same time. So this is something you should be explored. But on the other hand, you have to have it very strong from the very beginning. And it has also different challenges. So I think that exploring different models that are showing up recently should be also something that needs to be considered.
Great, thanks so much for those interventions, which are really some quite clear recommendations for things to consider and things to do. And also this question of making sure that the grievance process under Article 6.4 has the necessary sort of support and financing to operate, even if there are no grievances at first. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be there. So I think it's clear also to have a separate allocation to be sure that there's something that this will continue for the future. Now, so I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. If there are any questions that anybody would like to ask. Yeah, I think we can get a microphone from. Yeah, it'd be great if you could say your name if you'd like, and if you could address your questions to the specific person or if it's to the whole panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is David. I work with Fast in Action in Switzerland. And now listening also to you, actually responding to the first question on how also the different constituencies should be involved in this process of developing such a grievance mechanism. I was wondering what your thoughts are on how the LCIP, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, what its role could be in developing such a grievance mechanism. I understand it's the constituted body by the UNFCCC itself to kind of have this interaction between parties and indigenous communities and local communities. Yeah, so how do you see that?
I think that's a good question that I can start answering, and then Erika, you have an idea. Interesting question, because in my view, there's a reigning view within the UNFCCC and member states as well that actually that the local communities and Indigenous people platform represents Indigenous peoples. It actually doesn't, and let me explain why. You said it yourself. The LCIP is a constituted body. Its facilitated working group is made up of member states as well as Indigenous people. So, it can it can provide recommendations based on its work, based on its work plan. To when we, for example, would do when the UNFCCC would do submissions, that then the facilitated work group could provide its views in this matter. When it comes to, and that's why I use the word protagonist, because the Indigenous peoples themselves, actually, it is very important that they can participate in the process by themselves and don't have to go through what I would call a middleman like the platform. So the participation of the constituencies would be important. I can imagine that the constituted bodies would be invited to also provide any views that they have on the matter. And I think the broader the information range you get, in terms of workshopping towards a independent grievance mechanism, the better, because you get, you get a more, it gets more legitimacy in a way. So it's, I would say the participation of indigenous peoples is important, but also the participation of the local communities and any people platform would also be important, but not one through the other. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and professional insights. I have a quick question on the real-life implementation and operation of the independent grievance mechanism. So as you mentioned that there needs to be mechanisms, channels, and policies in place to ensure that this mechanism can actually guarantee confidentiality and accessibility. I'm just wondering what sort of institutional support and cooperation this mechanism might demand from the local governments in order to make this happen. Thank you so much.
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think that, first and foremost, what it would demand is an openness and not a skepticism towards it. So I think that to some extent, what it would demand from sort of local governments is local governments not trying to, if I'm understanding your question correctly, not getting in the way of people being able to access it or to use it. And so if you're thinking about a process, or if you're thinking about a mechanism that a community is trying to go to for say something that is generating carbon credits in a city, making sure that government making sure that communities are free to do that is important, and that there's not, that they're not trying to stop them, that they're not curtailing their ability to do it by retaliating or something, I think is a key part of accessibility. And not sort of trying to then figure out, if a complainant has filed a mechanism, trying to figure out who that is, because I think the protecting the confidentiality and making that is really a function of the mechanism itself. It needs to be able to have in place procedures and standards and ways of keeping confidential information that it gets from people who are being harmed, and the ability to do that. And so I think that's one thing. I think that the other thing on accessibility that, a community or government might need, the burden that would be on them would be to make sure that, if a project is taking place or something's happening, that there's information at the community level or at the project level about how to access a redress mechanism and how to do that. And so I think it's certainly less of a sort of financial burden or something that a local government would have to do, but really realizing that it shouldn't be impeding access to this mechanism, and thinking of itself and sort of seeing the mechanism as something that is there to ensure that, in some ways to ensure that a project is going right, or that if it's not going right, that people are getting remedy, and that actually makes things better, or that it can make things better. And so if there is going to be a mediation or a dispute resolution and the city is involved in some way, being willing to participate in that process, and not seeing it as not taking it personally or seeing it as, something has gone wrong, but really being open and thinking to yourselves, okay, people in the community have been harmed. Is there something that we're supposed to be doing or that we can do to help remedy that, and not impeding the process, I think is a key way.
Did you also want to speak to that, Paco, or no? I said the light is green. I wasn't sure. Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience to the panel? Otherwise, I can follow up with another question if we still have a little bit of time.
There's a question.
Okay, great.
Hi, Jakob Kronik, Forest of the World. Thank you very much for, it's new to me, a lot of it, and I have kind of a big question, but we've seen in Glasgow last year many donors making a forest pledge of maybe $20 billion, including 1.7 for indigenous peoples in Kenya. These should be used by 2025. There will be no mechanism, joint mechanism, it seems, financial mechanism, so you can't just, let's say, we would use the standards of the GCF or the World Bank or whatever. That would be for each of the donor to find out. You're recommending that you should do it from the bottom up. You should do it as early as possible, but with enough time to be able to undertake it. And the world also, of course, needs to see the results sustainably in preserved forests, etc. So I'm kind of just laying this on you. And can you see the dilemma and what should, I mean, how should all these independent financial mechanisms and however middle organizations deal with this, and could there be like a push for like a common set of rules, recommendations, whatever, so that results are being met in a human rights-based manner? Thank you.
Big question. Does anybody feel up to it?
I'll give it a go. So if it's yeah, the 1.7 billion pledge in Glasgow is something that is, if I recall, for local communities and Indigenous peoples in terms of conservation of the lands. First of all, it took us by surprise, by the way, that the pledge has been made. But that's a challenge that we also see within the Indigenous caucus. Is that because it's just not the states, but also private foundations, private funders actually, and so like who, in terms of due diligence, in terms of grievance process, for example, like so how will that be addressed? What we're trying to do as the caucus right now is to create a direct access mechanism. So like a funnel. So that everything has to go through something that's created by Indigenous peoples, and we're actually doing it right now, so that it is compliant in terms of the rights of Indigenous people, safeguards, and everything else. I have to be honest, I'm not involved in that conversation, luckily, because I am very bad with money. But it is something that, as a remedy to it, and the challenge that we're seeing as well. And we hope that this process or this mechanism will be ready before 2025. But it goes, like any mechanism, having 476 million Indigenous peoples all around the world, it takes time for us to consult all of these Indigenous peoples, to do due diligence, and that so every Indigenous region has its own views, has their own positions and priorities. So I get fragments of that conversation, and I'm very glad that I'm not in that conversation. But it is we're trying to deal with that through that particular mechanism that's being created. Yeah. Hopefully that gives an answer to your question. Thank
you. Well, I think we're just out of time almost. So I think with that we can probably conclude. So yeah, I think thank you very much to the panel for being here and for accepting our invitation to speak. It was really an insightful, interesting panel. We hope that the supervisory body is able to watch it and to get some insight in the design of the mechanism that they will be designing probably in the coming year. So yeah, urge them also to ensure that there's proper consultations in depth, that this happens in advance with full participation, as well as all the other recommendations that you all said much more eloquently. So yeah, with that, thank you very much, and on behalf of CCFD and Carbon Market Watch, thanks again, and hope this was interesting for you all.